Hi there, and welcome to this web lecture on behavioral research methods. My name is Peter Ruiten, and today we will be talking about data analysis. Do you know the consequences of having prior expectations? What are the differences between analyzing numerical or textual data? What are different approaches for analyzing data anyway? In this lecture, I will try to give you answers to these questions by focusing on three different themes. The first theme will focus on the difference between induction and deduction. The second theme shows what is the difference between qualitative and quantitative approaches. And finally, we will look at the differences between data and analysis. The first topic is induction versus deduction. Whether you take a theory-driven or a data-driven approach is telling you whether you are taking an inductive or a deductive approach. Induction means that you take a data-driven approach. This means that you start with an observation and from this try to derive your theories. On the other hand, deduction means that you take a theory-driven approach. As such, you start with a certain theory and try to collect data to test this theory. Let me show you how this works with the following visualization. On this left side, we see the empirical world. This is the world as we know it, in which we can do observations of human behavior. On the other side, we see the theoretical world. This world doesn't really exist, but this is where our theories are. Now, if we want to collect data in the empirical world and try to use this to derive certain theories, this is what we call induction. If, on the other hand, we start with a theory and start collecting data to test whether this theory is true, this is what we call deduction. So you can see that induction takes a data-driven approach and deduction takes a theory-driven approach. Let me give you an example of this research cycle by using both qualitative and quantitative approaches. For this, we will start with an observation. Our observation today is that chameleons are able to change color. I want to derive a theory from this observation, and for this I can use both qualitative and quantitative approaches. I choose to use a qualitative approach. This means that I take a very in-depth view of this one chameleon to try to understand what is going on. After this in-depth view, I can derive a theory. What I see is that this chameleon has specialized cells that allows it to change color. So my theory would be all chameleons have specialized cells that allow them to change color. If I want to collect some data from the empirical world to test whether this theory holds, I can again use both qualitative and quantitative approaches. For this one, I use a quantitative approach. In order to do this, I collect data from all kinds of different species of chameleons, and this data will tell me whether my theory is correct or not. And after analyzing all these different chameleons, I conclude that indeed they all have specialized cells that make them change color. I do have to note that some species of chameleons only have cells that can make them change from light to dark colors. Now, on top of the distinction between qualitative and quantitative approaches, we can also distinguish between data and analysis. We have seen that data can be both qualitative and quantitative by phrasing them into words or numbers. In the same way, analysis can also be qualitative or quantitative. This is by phrasing them into themes or statistics. In order to clearly explain what the differences are between qualitative and quantitative data versus analysis, let me show you the following table. In this table, we can see two columns, qualitative versus quantitative data, and we can see two rows, qualitative and quantitative analysis. If we want to do a qualitative analysis of qualitative data, we would do a so-called thematic analysis where we search for themes. If we want to do a qualitative analysis of quantitative data, we can do a so-called clustering analysis where we search for some clusters in our data. If we want to do a quantitative analysis of qualitative data, we can simply change words into numbers by counting events. If we want to do a quantitative analysis of quantitative data, we can make use of so-called statistics. Let me explain each of these four in a little bit more detail. We start with themes, or a so-called thematic analysis. With this analysis, we interpret texts by finding common themes and how they are related to each other. With a clustering analysis, we plot data from different variables in a graph to see if we can detect clusters. So we visually inspect our data, and as such we try to give meaning to numbers. By counting, we essentially turn data from words into numbers, and we count them or categorize them. As such, we can see how often a certain behavior occurs or how often somebody says something in an interview. Finally, with statistics, we can calculate the extent to which changes on one variable are related to changes on another variable. There's all kinds of different statistics available, but more information on this will be provided in the web lecture on statistical analyses. To wrap up this lecture, we have seen that there is a difference between data and theory-driven research. This is what we call deduction and induction. There's also a difference between using textual or numerical data, and this is what we call qualitative or quantitative approaches. Finally, we have seen that there are different approaches of data analysis that are dependent on whether we have qualitative or quantitative data and whether we want to do a qualitative or a quantitative analysis. And that concludes today's lecture on data analysis. I hope you enjoyed it and see you again next time.